Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101. We're going to do three pieces here on glossy cardstock with the perspective of kind of lying on your back and looking up at the sky type of kind of scenario or perspective. I'm going to start this one off. It's on a half-page piece of glossy with the Milky Way large stamp, okay? This comes in a nature set, but it also comes individually. All right, now what I'm doing right here, as far as the usage goes, is I'm overlapping one image to the next, or overlapping each impression as I lay it down here, okay? And that's key to using really any Stampscapes image, but especially skies, because they are rectangles, okay? They're not hard edge rectangles, but they do, peter out along the sides. They transition from solids into dots, okay? But it is important that you overlap these images about a ½ inch to an inch, somewhere in there. I mean, if you do it a little bit less or a little bit more, it's fine. But it's just kind of showcasing the extreme amount of overlapping you can do with these. And that's to eradicate those hard edges that someone could otherwise get if you try to line these up too carefully, like stacking bricks or something like that, okay, where you would be able to see that rectangle shape, the extremities of the perimeters, okay? So I'm taking the cloud right here, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm overlapping, I don't know, that might have been a full inch into that, the Milky Way impressions. And from one impression to the next, I'm kind of changing the angle slightly and adequately overlapping, okay? And you see that? You don't really see like a bunch of rectangle images everywhere. This is the one part that people have to get used to. I mean, if they do it for 10 seconds, they get it, okay? Because they say, oh my gosh, I don't have like all of these outlines or something like that that you would see if you were if you were overlapping outline style linear images. All right, so you overlap adequately with tonal images, and you won't have any problem with kind of the seamless aspect of the blending of imagery together. Okay, do you see how easy that was? No types of masking needed. I mean, you could mask things out and you could stamp these more carefully, but the point is that you really don't need to. Okay, so let's go with the next image here. I'm going to mix it up a little bit. We'll go with the Milky Way on one image, or one scene, a card, whatever. And this one I'm going to go with the moon. And I could have used the cloud around this moon, but I just wanted to kind of showcase the differences between blending additional tones over a very full background and blending this isolated moon in with all of that surrounding perimeter open space, just the white of the card. So I'll show you how to do both of that, both of these types of blending, I don't know, whatever you call it, assignments, I guess. All right, now we have this one right here. I'm choosing the Starbirth, one of my favorite sky images. It's kind of an image that came back from one of the initial images from the Hubble telescope that I always found really fascinating when I saw that. All right, so the same thing. I'm going to overlap one impression with the next. And I'm probably overlapping about, I'd say about a ½ inch or so. And do you see how I've slightly changed the angle, okay, from one impression to the next, so that it blends in very seamlessly, okay? Now here's what I'm going to do on this. I'm going to handle the cloud cumulus just like I did on the previous one, but see how those billows are pointed upwards? This will be the bottom of the scene, okay? And I'm just showing you, don't try to line up edge to edge. Adequately overlap. I see that, and you change the angle from one impression to the next. Always re-ink in between impressions. Now, one of the things that I do show on other videos, if you just want kind of the assurance that imagery is going to blend in with one another. After you ink up your stamp, before each impression, what you can do is you can wipe off about a 1/4 inch of ink around the perimeter. Don't take off everything, but just take a dry paper towel and just dab off around the perimeter. And that will make your images blend in even more kind of seamlessly and gracefully. But you can see you don't have to do that. But the darker and kind of wetter the pad is, the more ink that you're applying, it's possible to get kind of a more rectangle style of impression. Like if I'm using a very wet black pad or something like that, then I might want to dab off the perimeter before making my impressions, okay? That way it kind of stamps out lighter around the perimeter, and then when you have lighter perimeters blending in with one another, you won't have that hard edge, okay? All right, now this is just a paper towel, wadded up, and I put a few drops of re-inker fluid on it, okay? And when you do that, you really have an applicator that's really nice and full of ink, and it just blends and covers the areas that you want to cover very quickly and adequately in terms of the amount of ink that you want to use. And it just saves you a lot of time, okay? So one of the things I'm doing here is I'm kind of adding this ink around the perimeter, but here's the thing. I want some of those clouds to remain nice and light, okay? So this is how you color for lighting, okay? You apply color, but then you retain some of the white of the paper in some areas, okay? Now see, I used up a lot of ink there, so I'm re-inking my applicator. It could be a sponge or something like that, but I don't know. The paper towels work really well for me. Yeah, no problem. Okay, now see some of those stars in the background there. If I want some of those stars to remain nice and light, then what you do is you don't tone them out, okay? A lot of people, when they see a finished scene like these Milky Way ones or like that Starbirth one, when they see the end result, they say, how did you get that white in those stars? That's what they always want to know. They think you started with kind of a blue paper or something like that, and you've bleached the white of the clouds to get the white clouds, and you've bleached, those twinkly stars of the Starbirth to get those. They don't realize that you just don't tone them out, okay? It's because a lot of times stars are kind of positive things. They're not reversed light images amongst a field of darkness, like, this Milky Way is right here. Like this moon right here. A lot of times the moon is just this solid thing that you stamp into a scene. It's not the reverse area of light surrounded by darkness around it. So it's the darkness around this moon here. See, there's no outlines on this moon. Okay, it's just kind of this glowing sphere. But the glowing sphere has been defined by the tone around it, okay? So if you want that moon to remain, your light source, then you add tone around it, and you don't, just tone that white of the paper moon completely out. That's what confuses people when they don't see this process right here. Or when they're first starting out, they're used to maybe coloring a moon or something like that, not retaining the white that shows in the moon, okay? All right, so I'm filling in this whole area around this moon because I have this whole space in here. And I'm just going to continue on with this one. But see, that's the next color right there. But see how easy that is to just blend in there? Because I've used an adequate amount of ink on that base coat, the first color that I used. Kind of saturated the surface of the paper, and it got some of the paper pulp a little bit moist as well. It's not dripping wet or anything like that, otherwise this ink won't apply at all. But you get the surface a little bit moist. It's a little bit damp, It's not necessarily damp to the touch, but it's just damp enough to where when you're applying these darker colors, they just spread around so beautifully, okay? Now, if I was using a matte cardstock or a silk cardstock, that's a semi-coated paper, those ones are more absorbent. The more you move towards matte, the more absorbent they're going to be. So you can do this. It'll give you a matte look, not a glossy one. But what you do is you just use more of that base coat, so you really saturate your applicator, be it a paper towel or a sponge or whatever you're using. Okay. Now this is a pretty dark blue here. It's like a dark, almost black blue. Okay. But you can see how easy this is to spread around like this. And I'm kind of making it a little bit streaky too. I'm not just trying to fill in a solid application of color. And see how those kind of negative spaces amongst these darker streaks kind of becomes the atmosphere in haze, night haze or something like that. Now this is black. It doesn't look 100% black because as I apply it on here in this kind of motion, it's applying more of a, I don't know, I'd say like a 5% gray. Okay. I mean, I'm trying to build up more right here by tapping. So it's building up little beads of black ink like that. But there's my vignette around that one. Okay. Now I'm going back to these ones right here, the larger ones, and I'll add in some darker tones within these. Okay, now here's the thing too. The lightest color you get a lot more coverage with, okay? You'll use the lighter tones to go into your scene, you saturate it pretty good. But with your darker tones, your mid-tones to darker ones, maybe you don't go into the interior of the card quite as far, okay? That way what you get is this kind of transitioning area where in the interior somewhere in your scene, in this case, it's just, it's where my stars are, it's where the moon is, I don't know, that band of stars in the Milky Way, and on my clouds, okay? There's those areas of light like that, okay? Now, I got right up to them with my lightest colors, but with my darker tones, I'm kind of staying a lot more perimeter oriented. And that way when I get to the black, it's for the most part, it's just on the four corners. And that way you get this kind of this transitioning value scale where it's kind of lighter in the middle and it's darker on the side, and that gives the illusion that light is coming from within the card, okay? So just remember, the darker you go, the less ink you want to apply. Just in general. I mean, that's not always the case. Maybe you get darker on some, maybe you have less light. You know what I mean? It just depends, but that's just the general kind of idea as far as color transitions go. Okay, see this how I'm kind of applying this, and see how I'm kind of staying on the perimeter a lot more? And it's blending, just fine because the ink is, on the surface, it's pretty damp. Now I am getting in between some of those stars, but I'm doing it with a paper towel that I've already kind of applied a lot of that ink around on the perimeter. So it gets pretty dry. Now see, when I dip into that pad, I'm starting on the perimeter with it. But if I kind of apply for a little while, it gets very dry on the paper towel, and that's when I was doing it, using that color around the interior stars, the ones more towards the center. But see those stars, how they're generally kind of light within the scene still? It's because I just haven't toned them out with color, okay? Or with darkness. Alright, so see this building up some more kind of darker perimeters right there with that color. And sometimes what happens is you can build up a lot of ink on these surfaces, especially a glossy cardstock. And sometimes it almost becomes too wet to apply an additional color. It's because it's like trying to apply something wet into something that's already wet. It's just not going to transfer. It's just going to stay within your, in this case, an applicator, okay? So if you just let it sit, for a couple minutes, the inks on the surface of your paper will dry by evaporation or start to dry by evaporation. I don't want it to dry completely because then it'll be harder to blend my colors. So, just apply adequately. If you're in a very arid terrain, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, etc., you might have to go back sometime as you're applying your darker tones. You might have to go back with the lighter tone, maybe in re-inker form, and reapply another layer of lighter colors, not to make things look lighter, it's not going to do that, but just to dampen and moisten your surface again for whatever ink that you were working on at the time, maybe a darker tone. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of a tinge of green on this one. I just wanted to kind of alter these three different scenes slightly, from one another. Okay. Now, see, I'm applying a very dry layer of this very, very bright, very hot green in there. Okay. So that's how you control the amount of tone that you're adding. Okay, you just do a very light version of it, which is a very dry one. And if you were painting, we would call it dry brushing. I don't know what you would call it here, dry sponging or something like that. It's not a sponge I'm using, but that's kind of the technique. See that barely visible pink right there? That pink is otherwise very hot. You can see where I used it on the paper right next to it. But I'm just using a very dry version. Okay, now this is the thing that makes things really easy. If I just take that pink directly onto the scene, it becomes a much more precarious exercise. But as far as the process goes, if you want a careful application and one that you are in complete command with, then you just don't apply a huge amount of it at one given time. You just apply it through kind of repetition. If you can get kind of what you want in 50 strokes, but under complete control, that way you can apply exactly how much you want. That's going to be a lot easier than just taking some, super wet sponge or something like that and just kind of, applying it and kind of praying that it comes out. It's like the difference between calligraphy and I don't know, like a dry brushing effect. Calligraphy, it's what you get is, instantaneous. Okay, now I'm applying my foreground imagery. I'm going to use a VersaFine Clair, which normally wouldn't dry on glossy cardstock. I don't know, maybe if you're in super arid terrain, maybe it would or not, I'm not sure. But here's the thing. Okay, do you see how that spruce tree large is pointed, okay? What we're going to do is every time I stamp one of these, I'm going to point it at some vanishing point. Okay, so that star that I'm pointing at with my left hand, that's what I'm going to be pointing at every time I make an impression. I see people do this mistake all the time. Not that watch my videos because I mention it every time, but a lot of times people don't point their objects at the same vanishing point. Now, this isn't for everything. If you have like some kind of amorphic bush or something, it doesn't matter so much. But when it comes to trees, you always want them pointing at the same vanishing point. I've even seen some stamp designs by this one company that probably saw my pieces. So they did a whole stamp design that has like a perimeter of trees, but they had it they must have been used. They weren't thinking of any vanishing point. They didn't understand the concept of perspective. So they had trees going in every which direction. There must have been like 4 vanishing points instead of 1. So they were all going in the wrong direction from one another. So it's easy to do. I'm not using any kind of ruler. You can be off a little bit from one to the next. You can be off a 1/4 inch. But don't be off like, a huge amount. Otherwise it's going to look strange. Unless it's going to be something like a tree that's teetering or something like that. But see that? They're all kind of pointing, generally to that one thing. Don't have a ruler or anything like that. That's not necessarily. But here's this dead pine tree, okay? It's called leafless pines. And see how it's also pointing at that little star there. Okay? And that way you get the right perspective. It feels right like that. Okay? And one of the things I'm doing with these trees, notice how I group some trees, how I overlap some. I don't have it kind of all super equally spaced. It feels a little bit more natural when you do that like that. We all kind of have in ourselves, I think, kind of this feeling of pattern. It's built in. So I have to consciously not space all of my trees out completely equally, you know, like an inch apart or something like that. So that's what I have to do with like things like stars if I'm adding in little paint pen stars or something like that. I have to think of, I have to remind myself to kind of group some, to put them some closer to one another, to make different size ones. Okay, this is a clear embossing powder. Okay. Watch when you're holding your scenes. I put my finger in one of those trees because the, you know, that VersaFine clear, that oil-based pigment ink is very, very wet. So easy to run your finger through it, you know, when handling. All right, so let's see. Let's go with, there I guess we're going with our moon one. And I thought I would use some different foliage. I'm always using pine trees in these types of scenarios, but you know, you can do something kind of more intimate. Okay, this is foliage from the nature set number 29. And it's just putting these plants, these leaves, they're larger kind of silhouettes. So when you do this, what you're doing is when you have kind of foreground imagery that's fairly bold and large, what it does from an emotional perspective is it puts the viewer into the scene because objects are much closer to them, okay, this way. So it just, I don't know, it's a different kind of emotional feeling in many ways, having things close to the viewer, okay? And when people are looking at cards and whatnot, you know, they are viewers, and in this case, they're viewers of, I don't know, a scene or a location, okay? You're putting them into that scenario there. All right, look at that glow, though. You see where it's kind of that darker blue is kind of on the perimeter? I have that streak of blue kind of in the middle, too, but for the most part, it's lighter in the center and darker on the perimeter, okay? So don't worry when, you know, if you're toning your imagery and you're thinking, oh my gosh, that first blue, you know, I had to use a lot of it, that's taken a while. When you get down to those darker colors, you know, the darker colors are just a little bit of an application in the corners. If you're doing this type of kind of, you know, glowing, color glow scenarios, I guess you can call it. Got a little bit of a paper towel flake in my powders right there. Okay, this one right here. I get a little splotchy with that green. I would normally use 2 or 3 versions of green and kind of blend that out, but I wasn't worried about it because I was going to put a lot of foreground imagery over the top of this, so I wasn't worried about it at all. And if I want to, I can use some white pigment ink on there just to kind of blend in some of those clouds a little bit more. But I don't know, this whole video is really about the embossing, I don't know, I guess embossing impact. All right, this is the juniper branch from the nature set here. Oh, it's nature set number 28. This is the one with the things like the pine boughs and whatnot. All right, so kind of adding those in, almost looks like pickleweed or something like that. You see those in, I think it's wetlands areas or something like that. And it looks like juniper too. It reminds me of going out to the desert or something like that. Joshua tree or whatnot. And there are pines out there. There's pinyon pine out in Joshua tree. People think of deserts, they think, you know, kind of think of cacti, but there's a lot of pine trees out there in the high deserts. Or a lot of people, when they think of deserts, they think of the Sierras. I mean, not the Sierras, but the Saharas. Just with all sand. But a lot of deserts have a lot of life in them, flora and fauna. All right, so this is the larch, I think, branches left and right here. I'm trying to figure out an angle so that the left and right side doesn't look so symmetrical from each other, okay? So yeah, it kind of looks a little bit too symmetrical there, so I'm going to fill in that little space right up there just to make it look different from left and right. Okay, so when we do that, something like that, we're creating this kind of framework. We've added things that are closer to us, but it's also provided framing, okay? We often frame by matting our cards or, mounting them. But in scenic stamping, you can also use imagery as kind of the first framing device for your piece, your card, your scene. And again, it puts us, as the viewer, kind of right into the scene. It provides kind of a framework, a window into that other world. And this window, in this case, or these windows, will be kind of enhanced with that kind of three-dimensional aspect of the embossing powders. All right. If this is the first video you've watched of mine, or you haven't watched the one that I just did on embossing, I haven't embossed until this week, and I'm just kind of following along this book called Rubber Stamping for the first time. I'm just going over some basic kind of techniques, and there's nothing more basic than embossing, so I don't know, I just haven't gotten around to doing it, but I've always thought of different embossing applications that would be cool, and one of them was foregrounds for our scenes, and having this kind of three-dimensional aspect or kind of area of our scenes. It just, I don't know, it adds in a nice element to the scenes, having that actual raised image like that. It really brings the foreground out from the background, even more so than just having a darker color. I've usually just done it in a nice dark color, but having something raised like this. It's not only raised, though, a raised black image, but you can see that raised dark image against, like, say, a dark sky in this case. It catches the light, especially with this clear embossing powder. It catches the light, so it's not just this negative space in there of a dark image, okay, which, looks good too. I've been doing that for years, but I don't know. This looks awfully good here in terms of I don't know, just added, like I said, added dimension. It's actual physical dimension. Before it's kind of visual dimension, having just something just darker, but these are physically raised, okay, so it's a raised image. So, and like I said, again, it's kind of textural too, with that reflective quality. And it's adding kind of multiple kind of I don't know, multiple added treats to the scene. Okay, so that's my foundation, but these are really going to, I don't know, to me they really need kind of the star of the scene. The embossing, and the embossed foreground imagery is quite, strong aspect of it, but if you stamp something like animals, in this case birds in the sky, or quote stamps, those really become the focal points. Because people want to read, what something says in a visual, or if there's something like wildlife, or especially a person in a scene, that person will typically be the kind of the focal landing point, that someone will go through on their visual path of looking at a scene, okay? All right, so there's that quote stamp right there. All of these quote stamps are coming from Scenic Sentiments, sheet number 2, which is, that one's kind of about, primarily about the night sky, okay? This one's the strongest one with the lie on your back and look at the stars type of feel with that surrounding type of tree structure. So that's the quote that I use there. Okay, now I'm not going, I thought about embossing these word stamps, but I thought I want them to kind of recede from the foreground. I want the foreground imagery to really stand out, so I'm just doing these ones in just black dye-based ink. Try to figure out a good location for these, and I'm just eyeballing it. I know I'm always kind of worried about that these quote stamps are going to come out kind of angled or something like that, but I don't know. If they do, I just figure, oh well, I don't care. And I could always just stamp them on a separate piece of paper if it's really bad. And then just, I would probably mat that little piece of paper that the quote stamp's on. And then I would just paste it right over the top of one of these. Okay, so here comes our kind of big, bold focal point here. It's just a big eagle. And the quote is, good friends are like stars. You don't always see them, but you know they are always there. So I'm doing these two eagles in here. One's kind of near and one's kind of far, okay? But see how that kind of, it's kind of like a metaphor for friendship or whatnot. I don't know. I mean, birds can be friends too, but you put those in there like that. And one's kind of distant, okay, you know? I mean, they could see each other right there, but it kind of follows along the lines of that quote. All right, now, and I don't know if you'd see birds flying at night, but it's a romantic type of visual. Okay, now I'm doing the two different birds. And I blotted one off so that one would stamp lighter than the other one. Okay, so it looks like they're kind of flying in like a thermal up into the sky. I feel that these birds kind of in a night sky kind of adds to the dreamy quality of the visuals. And like I said, it's kind of a visual landing point within the scene. I don't know, that one, I don't know if that, maybe the moon's more of the visual landing point because it is so strong in the piece. But I don't know what I was talking about there, but but look at that foreground in there. Look at those foregrounds really stand out from the background. Okay, now this is how I have matted them off and completed them. I thank you for watching the video and hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't embossed for a while, dip into those embossing powders and have a go at them. I think you'll really enjoy them as far as use with your scenic scenarios.